In American elections, there are a handful of recurrent voting patterns among various populations, but one particular voting trend has been especially frustrating for Republicans, and that is a consistent 80 to 90% of the African American vote going to the Democratic presidential candidate since 1964, along with general majority support in non-presidential races. Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another video for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have videos like this every week, so be sure to subscribe and stay tuned. Now before we go any further, I would like to take a moment to thank everyone who has donated to us on Patreon and right here on YouTube through channel memberships. Having dealt with demonetization and even censorship in the past, especially when covering more sensitive topics, support from our patrons and donors helps make regular videos possible. Every donation goes a long way to keeping our channel going, and as a show of thanks, if you donate to help support the channel, you'll gain access to some great perks, including physical merchandise, a custom-designed flag wallpaper, and access to an exclusive members-only Discord server where you can enter your scenarios for a chance to have them made into full videos, or just chat with me in the community directly. You can follow the pop-up on screen here, go to the description or comment section to visit our Patreon page and support our channel, and of course you can do so by clicking the join button next to the subscribe button right below this video. If you can't donate anything, please consider subscribing and sharing this video to help the channel out. Now, back to the video. If you've paid attention to the last few election cycles, you may have noticed a significant effort from the Republican Party to broaden its appeal to non-white voters, chiefly Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and of course African Americans. For a handful of Republican voters, there is a sense of general confusion. After all, as the GOP often likes to boast, they are the party of Lincoln. It was the Republicans who freed the slaves, and the Democrats are the real racists, and so on and so forth. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, African Americans had been a deeply loyal Republican voting bloc, and would remain so for several decades, though did begin to grow disillusioned with the party toward the turn of the century. It's important to remember that in America, especially following the Civil War, party names ceased to matter. The two-party system created a series of conditions in which ideology superseded party affiliation, and by the time of the Progressive Era, one could find progressives dominating both parties with only slight variances in their platforms. The Republican Party of the Civil War era, the party which saw to the abolition of slavery, was a whole different animal than the GOP of today. The early Republican Party was a relatively radical faction based in principles of equality and egalitarianism, industrialization, centralization, westward expansion, and protectionist economics, challenging the conservative establishment of the Democrats in the South, who largely stood on a platform of agrarianism, free trade, and decentralized government. As ideology homogenized across both parties, African Americans in the 1920s, many of whom had found their way out of the rural South and into the urban North, began seeking politicians who would stand on policies which favored both minorities and urban communities. This would result in a widening division within the black community insofar as party support, but it wouldn't be until the election of FDR that a majority of African Americans flipped from supporters of the Republican Party to supporters of the Democratic Party. FDR during this time would also see to the establishment of political machines within urban areas, which would later facilitate continued Democratic dominance of urban centers, and consequently further solidify the relationship between urban blacks and the Democratic Party. FDR's successor, Harry Truman, would be fundamental in swinging increasing numbers of African Americans away from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party by actively working towards civil rights policy. These sentiments would be echoed by Democrats John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson, who saw to the passage of the Civil Rights Act and seemingly locked in the black vote for the Democratic Party, but at the cost of perpetually losing the support of the conservative South, who in later years would be courted by the Republicans as a stable Republican bloc. The modern Republican Party, in the eyes of some African Americans, thus became the party which abandoned them to embrace the southern states which opposed civil rights. In more contemporary times, some African Americans have seen the Republican Party as a representation of the white establishment in America, this white establishment being responsible for perpetuating institutions they see as racist and not representative of black interests, seeing the GOP as a group which was fundamentally opposed to the well-being of African Americans. The existence of this perspective of the parties in a racial lens has become increasingly clear as African American ideological parity with the Democratic Party as a whole has grown wider apart over the years. Yet despite this, sees the Democrats maintain overwhelming black support given the African American perspective of the Democratic Party as an opposition faction to the white establishment. Or in simpler terms, a number of African Americans recognize that the Republican Party, whether intentionally or not, perpetuates policies which favor white interests and lifestyles at the expense of black interests and lifestyles, and thus opt to support the Democratic Party in opposition to what they see as a systemically racist American establishment, even despite not seeing eye to eye with the Democrats on a majority of policy. Today, the political ideology of the African American population has three dominant branches. There are additional factions, but we'll concentrate on the three largest. The largest school of thought most commonly held among middle to lower class urban and suburban African Americans is characterized by a less ideological and more inherent social conservatism, including opposition to LGBT rights, opposition to immigration, opposition to feminism, belief in traditional gender roles, and high religiosity, as well as a strong sense of distinct racial identity. Naturally, these positions clash with many of the liberal sensibilities of the Democratic Party. However, with African Americans being regarded as a marginalized group, they are often the recipients of Democratic attention and support, which in turn has shaped this faction's perspective of politics as a means through which to enrich their communities. As a result, this faction of African Americans has come to advocate for greater contributions to lift up the black community, including reparation payments, affirmative action programs, the adoption of diversity quotas, etc. Despite these seemingly larger-scale policies, this branch of ideology is also somewhat small government, with a major focus on community and neighborhood-level government over state and federal-level government. This faction can also be found to hold relatively pro-labor and old-left views, as a good segment of this faction tends to be employed in blue-collar jobs, as well as within bureaucratic positions with strong union participation. The chief character of this faction is primarily tribalistic, as it seeks the benefit of the black community, most especially the local black community, above all else. The most ideological of this faction, what we might call a smaller sub-faction, can also be quite radical, especially in regard to its xenophobia and far-left economic views. The two smaller of the three factions are comprised of African Americans who have, to a degree, assimilated into the larger white culture in two distinctive ways: the socially liberal culture and the fiscally conservative old-right culture. Socially liberal African Americans typically belong to a more affluent background, are generally non-religious or less religious than the average of the African American population, and have typically achieved a higher degree of education than the average American population in general. Politically, this group holds similar views to social liberals and progressives, including supporting LGBT rights and immigration reform, not quite being fixated on exclusively pro-black policy, though still this remains a key component of the ideology. Socially liberal African Americans will generally support the use of greater government power and can at times be sympathetic to socialist or even further left economic policies. Old-right African Americans are typically of a rural background and have come to embrace a sense of broader American identity beyond merely black identity, as well as have grown to favor American-style capitalism and entrepreneurial values, seeing honest business and hard work as keys to long-term success that any American of any race or financial background can achieve. This faction generally supports small government policies, deregulation, free enterprise, and pro-Christian political policies, being broadly responsible for the some 10% of black voters who will regularly support the Republicans. As you might imagine, the majority faction and socially liberal faction will by and large throw their support behind the Democratic Party, and this accounts for most of the some 80+% of the black vote going to the Democrats. Republicans in contemporary times have sought to appeal to the African American community in a myriad of ways, most often through attempting to create greater job opportunities for African Americans, reduce black unemployment, promote black home ownership, etc. However, an honest observation of black perspective on party politics reveals that this will not suffice to chip away at African American support for the Democrats, as once again for the majority of African Americans, party politics is not a matter of specific policy, but a matter of identity and representation, and despite the Democratic Party being out of alignment with core African American social values, it is the party which emphasizes most strongly its desire to give the community greater representation, greater wealth, greater recognition, and ultimately greater power with which to challenge the establishment which they view as institutionally rigged against them. The some 20 or so percent of the African American population which supports social liberalism is also unlikely to be swayed by these Republican platitudes, as they share even less common ground with the party given that they lack the social conservatism of the larger faction. What's also quite interesting is the inter-faction dynamics at play, primarily between the largest faction and the faction which will actually vote Republican, the latter often being ridiculed by the larger faction as compromised, phonies, or even traitors for voting in favor of, from their perspective, the white man against the interests of the black community. American history has shown a trend of the majority of the African American community rallying together behind the party which explicitly favors them as a group the most, and given the common perspective among the community that the very institutions of the country are rigged against them, it's reasonable to see why this mentality would emerge. In the aftermath of the Civil War, when it was clear that the Republican Party was the pro-black party, it naturally received the greatest share of support from the black community, but as issues of abolition and civil rights fell to the wayside, that became less clear, and this was reflected in the widening support for both parties among the black community. But when FDR came along with policies which indirectly favored blacks living in urban areas and offered an opportunity to undo the effects of the Great Depression, which primarily affected urban states, he gradually gained more of the community's support, and the country would later see black support for the Democratic Party solidified during the Civil Rights era, when New Deal Democratic figures became the chief advocates for civil rights policies, with this continuing on into the neoliberal era, and the African American community growing distrustful of Republicans whose adoption of states' rights policies, of law and order policies, of meritocratic policies, all appeared to the African American community as mere euphemisms for policies aimed at disenfranchising them. But what do you think? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Mr. Z, out.